Hello, welcome to the RSK Biocensus First Thursday Club in February. Today we've got Stephanie Wray going to be talking about Nature Positive. But before we do that, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes to talk about. Those of you who've been with us before, you'll know most of these, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, everybody will be muted throughout the presentation. But any questions you have, then we have the question pull-out box that you can add questions to throughout the presentation, and we'll be taking the questions and answer stuff at the end. So I'll sort of sort through those and then run the Q&A at the end. After the presentation and after we've all gone, we'll be sending out a questionnaire, a sort of feedback form. So we'd appreciate if people could take the time to fill that in, because it helps us refine what we're doing here. That would be really useful. So it's just up to me now to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Stephanie Wray has been involved in ecological consultancy for 25 years, ish, I think that's fair to say, and is a past president of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. She helped establish and now chairs the Strategic Policy Panel for SIEM. And I think it's fair to say that Steph has been at the forefront of increasing public awareness in the importance of sustainable ecosystems, and has for almost her whole career strived to continue to achieve that sweet spot between progress and development, but also benefits for the natural world. And this epitomises what all of us in the sector are trying to achieve, and also I think epitomises what Nature Positive is trying to achieve. Steph is a director of Biocensus and a managing director of Nature Positive and RSK Wilding, and today is going to talk to you about the birds and the bees, apparently. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Tim. Right, I'm just going to turn off my webcam, I think, so we can look at the presentation, and we will drop right in. Brilliant. Okay, well, just to let you know a little bit about who we are then at Nature Positive. First of all, we're a subsidiary of RSK Biocensus, Tim's business, and that's why I'm here at First Thursday Club talking to you. And most of us are ecologists, but it's not an ecological consultancy. We very firmly identify as a management consultancy because we're working with companies on their transition to being sustainable enterprises. And our services are based on the understanding that everything that we rely on in business comes from nature, and that to be truly sustainable, we need to better understand that relationship with nature and how we rely upon it. So if I could get my slide to move on, we'll just see. Right, so the phrase Nature Positive, you know, we were called Nature Positive for a reason. The phrase Nature Positive has been gaining currency in recent months, and it's recognised that if we're going to emerge from this pandemic in a better way and build back better and build back greener, as you've heard government saying in recent months, we need a new mindset. We can't go back to business as usual, and the changes we need are transformative, they're proactive, and they've got to be founded in evidence, in sound science. So the World Economic Forum has been calling for a climate neutral and nature positive future. Those two things are linked in exactly the same way that the climate change and biodiversity crises are linked. And businesses are already describing themselves as working towards being nature positive. Now, that might all sound like a really way out way of doing business and something that we haven't really thought about before. It is in some ways, it's a whole new paradigm. It means reviewing company processes and operations, your procurement strategy, your business model, and identify opportunities that achieve positive outcomes for nature at each stage. And those might be things like regenerative agriculture, wildlife-friendly farming, nature-based solutions, zero deforestation, and circular economy initiatives. And if you think that sounds too much, just think about how much has changed in terms of health and safety since this photograph was taken in New York about 100 years ago. I think if you tried to talk then about human factors in safety or safety culture, nobody would have had a clue what you were talking about. But it doesn't have to take 100 years. Think how much has changed in 15 years since the Stern report was produced on climate change, and now we're on an almost plausible journey to net zero. So I can't say this enough, that what businesses have been doing so far on biodiversity perhaps hasn't been life-changing. There's nothing wrong with what's been done. Some of it's really great practice, but it's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about looking at flora and fauna associated with your work. I'm talking about this thing called biodiversity. So what do I mean by that? Well, you've got a definition there that's generally accepted. It springs out of the 1992 Conference on Biological Diversity, but it's essentially the sum total of all of life on Earth, all of those messy, complicated and perfect interactions between everything alive on the planet, the whole biosphere. And when you put it like that, of course it's important to your business, isn't it? And this is why we call these things ecosystem services, and they are the goods and services provided by nature. They're free at the point of use, and they're generally off balance sheet, but they're not necessarily limitless. And we can value some of these goods and services. So, we've divided them into 4 types here. You've got the provisioning services, things that we harvest directly from nature, like food and timber, some of the minerals. We've got supporting services that are things like nutrient cycling and forming of habitats. We've got regulating services like climate regulation, carbon sequestration, flood prevention. And then we've got the slightly more abstract cultural services around education, aesthetics, recreation, and just that sense of wonder and awe of being in nature. Now, there are market prices for some of these things. It's a market price for carbon, of course. It's still massively underpriced and it will go up. But not all of these things can be monetized, and that's perhaps why they've been to a degree ignored in companies' operations over many years, and they haven't fully been taken into account in planning how we do business. Now, a lot of organizations use the UN Sustainable Development Goals in setting their strategies and setting their actions in corporate responsibility. And they can indeed be used that way. RSK, we use them ourselves in our corporate responsibility. But I would say that they're not always necessarily used in the most appropriate way. They're not an a la carte menu. You just can't pick and choose the ones that you fancy having a bash at, even if that's goal 13 on climate action. Thank you. But businesses tend to choose things that they can put out a good story on, perhaps. And so it's a tendency that people could be accused of greenwashing. So what we're suggesting is that to be sustainable, I call it the SDG IQ, to be sustainable and actually deliver on the SDGs, then you need a firm base. And, I would say that I'm an ecologist, but the firm base has to be goals 14 and 15, life under the water and life on Earth. Because if you haven't got that bit right, it doesn't really matter what you're doing on goal 5 or goal 6, because ultimately, if you haven't got functioning ecosystems, the rest of it isn't going to work. So we need to look at goals 14 and 15. We need to look at the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that support everything you do, and then we can build from there once we've got a stable base. So what does that mean for business then? Well, you might rely on some kind of natural capital. It might be timber or petrochemicals, soy or rubber. It might be lithium, rhodium, iron ore. It might even be sand for the production of glass. Or you might carry out an action that impacts on those flow of benefits from nature. You might use a lot of water. I don't know about you, I wouldn't want to be in almond milk right now. You might be releasing some sort of effluent into water. You might be a really responsible mining company, but as it happens, the roads that you build to get to your sites open up areas that were previously unavailable to access by poachers or illegal loggers. And these critically lead to business risks. They're not just about the risks to the environment. And they might be risks of supply. So something that you've previously relied on gets harder to get hold of, or its price goes up. There might be risks of policy or legislation. You might have seen the consultation that DEFRA did towards the end of last year around forest products with embedded deforestation and whether companies should be responsible for the sustainability of commodities that they import. There might be reputational risks around, whether it's acceptable to use a particular commodity. That might lead to customer action. They might vote with their feet and go to different brands, or it might affect your ability to attract inward investment. And I'll say it again, this isn't about how many badges there are in the grounds of your office. It isn't about doing a BAT survey. Those things are important, and those are what traditional ecological consultancies will do for you. But what we're talking about is really digging into what are the actual impacts of your business right up and down the value chain. So for many organizations, their biggest impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services will be how the customers use or critically dispose of your products, or it'll be where your raw materials come from. It won't necessarily be in your direct operations. So we would say that it's quite straightforward, really. All companies have direct and indirect links to nature that they can't afford to ignore anymore. If we recognize it and act on this, then it could be truly transformational in the way we do business. But it's not just about the common good. I genuinely believe that businesses that respond to this agenda and ensure that their operations are more sustainable in terms of how they rely on nature, that they'll be more competitive and they will be the businesses that succeed in the future. Now, if you want a lesson from history, these issues aren't new. I don't know if you're familiar with the product on the left-hand side of the picture there. It's palm oil. And so, as you'll be aware, palm oil is associated with large-scale deforestation in many parts of the world, including Indonesia, and affects species such as orangutan, one of our closest relatives. Now, a while ago, Unilever ran a lovely ad campaign around their product line Dove, which is built on a non-traditional platform for that kind of personal care product that uses real women, not models. It doesn't airbrush photos. They're all about female empowerment and so forth. They ran a great campaign. It's going back about 10 or 15 years, I think, where they talked about, it was Talk to Your Daughter, about the onslaught of the beauty industry and how that could affect her, and talk to your daughter before the beauty industry does. And Greenpeace then picked up on this, picked up on Unilever's use of palm oil, and ran a parody advert, essentially, which was very similar, but it focused on a young Indonesian girl standing in front of a forest, and then there were lots of onslaught images of trees being cut down and dying orangutans and so forth. It was a hugely powerful and very effective campaign, and it had a significant impact on Unilever's share price for the impact of one brand and its use of one natural product. Now, a smaller company might not have survived that. Unilever certainly did turn it around and became very actively involved in sustainable palm oil initiatives. But we don't know what the next palm oil is necessarily. We might want to think about what commodities we use that people aren't necessarily thinking about yet, and really get to understand where those risks and vulnerabilities are in our supply chain. Now, it's not just about consumer action either. This is getting baked into policy here in the UK and around the world. So earlier this week, I was really pleased to see the launch of the Dasgupta review. Now, this is a formal review that was commissioned by Treasury, and that's really important. It isn't just another report by NGOs about the decline in nature. It isn't even a report tucked away in DEFRA that, well, that's interesting to people who are interested in the environment. It was commissioned and published by the Treasury, and it was introduced by the Prime Minister when it was launched this week. And the Dasgupta review about the economics of biodiversity says that our unsustainable use of nature is endangering the prosperity of current and future generations. And that at the heart of that, it's not just a market failure because we failed to deal with these ecosystems, goods and services and kept them off balance sheet. That's a whole institutional failure. The whole of how we run our economy doesn't work. It says that the economy isn't separate from nature, and we can't continue to treat it as an externality. I think it's a really interesting thing. I mean, people often come home from work and say, oh, I was stuck in some terrible traffic tonight. And well, you weren't stuck in traffic, you were traffic. You were part of that problem. And I think that's what the move that we have to make here is. We have to see our businesses as having been part of this problem of not taking these factors into account that are significant risks for us, and we have to become part of the solution. And that's what forward-thinking businesses are doing. We need to change how we think, act, and how we measure success by using nature more sustainably, by accounting for natural capital, by bringing these things onto the balance sheet. And then we have to transform our institutions in how we actually deal with this at a national and supranational level. Okay, now, as well as at a national level here, although I think this document will resonate much further around the world in the way that the Stern Review did, we also have at the moment process towards the COP, the Conference of the Parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity, which will be meeting in China at some point later this year. And coming towards the COP, we've been developing drafts of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and that will be signed by countries around the world. Boris Johnson has already indicated his intention that the UK will sign. And this is about placing nature at the heart of the global economy. So it's about reforming subsidies and incentives that damage nature and putting those incentives towards things that restore ecosystems, to value and embed nature in decision making, and to adopt targets to reverse the loss of nature. And this is very much the direction of policy travel that businesses need to understand. So it's quite complicated, and so you need a shortcut. What are the things that you need to be looking out for if you want to understand where your business interacts with nature? Well, these are the five the five main pressures on biodiversity that were identified in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So they're quite broad, and you probably need some support in understanding where they arrived in your value chain, but it's broadly, are you doing something that affects land use? Are we converting land from a natural habitat to a man-made use? Are we polluting either to water, air, or to the land? Are we emitting greenhouse gases? Are we contributing to climate change? Are we releasing or causing to be released invasive species? Or are we over-exploiting or over-harvesting something? And so this is what you can do if you want to look at that within your business. So you can do a baseline biodiversity assessment. You will never know, you'll never get where you want to go unless you know where you are now and you're starting from. So we can do sort of full biodiversity and natural capital audits for your sites and for your supply chain. We can look at supply chain risk assessments and see whether there's embedded deforestation, pollution, or water resource risks. When you've got through that, you can actually start to put a measure on that, a biodiversity footprint with a range of tools, and we can look at some of those in a minute. We can develop strategies and action plans. You can report on that through GRI against the SDGs, or with an in-house bespoke approach. And then where you have impacts that you can't avoid or reduce any further, then there are means to do practical mitigation, compensation, and offsetting through actions like biodiversity net gain and rewilding. So there's a lot that businesses can be doing. Here's just a few examples of some of those things. Looking first of all at biodiversity baselines, this is some work we're doing at the moment in China. So the picture on the left-hand side with the purple, that shows essentially a measure of biodiversity intactness. So how much biodiversity has been eroded and lost is in the paler areas where it's been lost, and the darker, more concentrated purple is more natural. And then on the right-hand side, that pinky color maps the location of an internationally recognized biodiversity hotspot. So that's where there's high levels of endemic species, and there's also high levels of human threat. And overlain on that, on the little grey areas, you can see those are tree plantations. So you can see how if we're sourcing timber in this part of China, this is Yunnan province, then we might want to think about, well, what's the damage that we're doing? Where are the areas of most threat? Where are there lots of endemic species that we might want to be avoiding? And we might want to be getting our timber from a different part of that province. When it comes to supply chains, we know you don't like scope 3, nobody likes scope 3, but that is usually where most of your biodiversity impacts are going to lie. So we really do need to be able to get to grips with it. But where to start? Lots of companies have very complicated supply chains. If you're a big multinational, you'll have tens of thousands of suppliers. Some companies genuinely do not know where their raw materials come from. They can't track back that far because their supply chains are so complex and go through so many stages. What we need to do then is to take each product and map the value chain so we understand how that product comes about, right from raw materials to end of use with consumers through your own manufacturing or development process. And we need to identify from that value chain what are the key sustainability issues to be considered at each stage of that. Is it greenhouse emissions, pollution, water use, social impacts, and so on? You know, maybe the extraction or processing of a raw material uses a lot of energy. Maybe there's hazardous byproducts, or maybe there's issues of modern slavery associated with the material. Now, then you might split that down a little bit further by geography. So timber coming from the US or Canada might be associated with a different level of environmental risk than timber from Brazil. You know, if you use fluorspar, then you might be more concerned about it, whether it comes from South Africa or France, based on the level of social impact. So for each of those identified sustainability risks, you can look at, well, how big an issue is it? How big a reputational or risk would it be for us? What's the severity of that? How much control can we have over the use of that material? And then you can prioritize actions. You can identify where are the sort of red flags in your supply chain and focus your effort onto, okay, well, we might not know who every supplier is and where every step is, but I think actually we need to know where most of our iron ore is coming from, whatever the material might be, and focus in on what are the key issues and working out how we can improve that. And then work with suppliers to inform and help them to switch to more sustainable sources. Might be giving advice at the other end of the value chain to customers on safe disposal of products, or making broad decisions of supply between alternative materials. So this is a way to move quickly into understanding where your risks are. And when we've got some more idea about that risk, there's a whole range of tools available for measuring biodiversity impact at a corporate or organizational level. Now, there's a little selection there. Those are all designed in different geographies and different sectors to do different kinds of things. But ultimately, you can use various tools, or you can develop bespoke tools in order to understand your risks in a better way. And I saw another new tool arriving last week, which I think is really good for comparing levels of land use. It converts different raw materials into a land use figure, so you can use a sort of a footprint in hectares based on that. And it's not about sort of playing tunes on this and seeing what makes you look best. It's around really trying to understand what's the best for your business, what's going to be comparable to your peers, and what's going to be most useful to help you manage business risks. Now, as well as this being important to businesses, it's obviously important to people who invest in businesses as well. And you might want to look at risk profiles in different sectors, because although most ratings agencies will give you an overall perspective on sustainability, there's very little depth in their assessment on biodiversity in most cases. It tends to be a straightforward, have they got a biodiversity action plan? Tick, okay, let's move on and look at another risk. But this is becoming more important as we see the impacts of climate change, the importance of nature-based solutions. We'll see increasing focus on biodiversity and natural capital. And so through due diligence and transaction, we're going to be seeing much more interest in this. I think there'll be much more development from IFC Performance Standard 6 out into really getting a depth of understanding of the natural capital accounts of an organisation that's perhaps an acquisition target. So just as a sort of an example of how you can go about and make these changes, a little case study. This is some work we're doing on at the moment with an ethical fashion brand. They've got relatively straightforward short supply chains. So somebody grows a material, you process it, you dye it, you turn it into clothes and you ship them. So it's fairly straightforward, but exactly where raw materials are grown isn't always straightforward. They come in through big collectives. You're not entirely sure that material is traceable right to source. They use a range of materials, but one of them is bamboo. Comes from China. It's considered a very sustainable textile, and indeed it is. It's a very useful crop. It doesn't need any fertilizers or pesticides to grow, and you harvest it. It's a grass, so you harvest it. It's like cutting the grass, and it grows back again. It's not like uprooting a tree or clear felling a forest. So it's got great things going for it, but they still have questions. What are the real impacts? What are the biodiversity issues? Where does it grow? You know, is it better to harvest it from a natural forest, or is it better to harvest it from a plantation? Because what was that plantation before it was cleared to be a plantation, and so forth? How should we report on this? And so we've been looking at the supply chains through China. We've been looking at how to manage these areas more sustainably. What's the best route to making sure you don't have impacts on biodiversity or any ecosystem services, right through from where the material's grown, through processing and the chemicals associated with that process, through dyeing and garment making, through shipping and logistics, right back through to the consumer. And now our clients thinking about how they want to report on that and how they want to develop a more obvious a way of approving that, of making people tie to a standard and working with others in the fashion industry to perhaps come up with a new standard for certification of sustainable fibres based on that work, rather than just necessarily perhaps doing FSC certification, which might not be as relevant to a bamboo plantation in China as it is to a boreal forest. So that can be a fairly straightforward piece of work, but it can really dig very deep into where your real impacts are and what you can do about them. And there will be practical things that you can do about them. So I'm going to leave it there, I think, Tim, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steph. That was great. Okay, we have a couple of questions that have come in throughout the talk, but please, while we're doing this Q&A, if everybody's got other things that spring to mind, then just pop them in the question box and we'll ask them to Steph. One of the ones I've got here, Steph, was how do you think this would link in, what you'll be talking about, I'm guessing what they mean, with organisations like Fairtrade, FSC and other similar organisations?
Yeah, okay. It's a matter of looking at what are the best tools and the best certification systems for the particular material. So, for example, FSC certification is fantastic for some things, and it's become almost universal in this country. It's inconceivable that a responsible company would be trying to import timber that didn't have FSC certification. But when we're looking at different parts of the world or different types of habitat, well, maybe it's not necessarily it's not necessarily the right thing to do. So, for example, one of the suppliers in China that we talked to runs a bamboo plantation, and he has two sides of his plantation, one of which is FSC certified and one of which isn't. And he cuts from the FSC certified side when he has a client in Europe to support, because they want the FSC certification. There is absolutely no difference in how the two sides of the plantation are managed. It's simply that there's more paperwork if you take the FSC side, and he does that when he needs to for European customers. It's managing the plantation in the same way. So we're about sort of going back to the science and digging in a little bit deeper and trying to say, well, yeah, the tick box is great, but the tick box is a proxy for real action. And where we can, let's do real action if we're trying to get transformative change.
Okay, thank you. I suppose this is sort of vaguely linked, in a sense it's sort of socio-political, but the question is Brexit. How do you think this affects the changes that you've outlined? It's hard to talk about these sort of things without mentioning that word, I know. But
I don't know. I haven't talked about Brexit for about 2 weeks. It's been great. How is this affected by Brexit? Well, the European Union at the moment is working on guidelines for mandatory natural capital reporting. So in the way that companies here are already required to report on their carbon emissions, the European Union is working on sort of generally accepted accounting principles for natural capital. So within the next few years, that will be mandatory across the EU. So we're no longer part of that. We won't fall within that mandatory reporting. However, the noises that the government has been making around this, the launch of the Dasgupta review this week saying that we need natural capital accounting, the things that have come through from the Natural Capital Committee talking about how we need to move to this sort of accounting process, how we need to use environmental net gain, leads me to believe that we wouldn't be very far behind in adopting that. And I think it's a logical next step. To be honest, for me, there's a huge focus on climate change, which is obviously massively important, but it's inextricably linked to biodiversity loss and to the natural world. And I think we have to tackle the two together, because as we get closer to 2030, if we don't, we'll start to see that actually we thought we had to make this level of change to keep climate change within acceptable limits, but it's not working. And the reason it won't be working is because we're not dealing with the nature-based solutions part of it properly. So I think it, yes, there'll be changes, we'll have our own legislation, but ultimately this kind of issue is a global issue. It needs to be dealt with supranationally, and I can envisage in the future perhaps a sort of a UN-based an international organisation which is around, a model something like the WHO for health, for being for nature.
Interesting. Okay, another one here from Richard. Really interested how this could feed into construction, main contractors in cities, not just rural housing developers, which I imagine could be very complicated. The industry focus now is on carbon, but I can see this becoming one of the next big focuses.
Yeah, thank you. I agree, actually. I really think it is. And I've got I've got a strong sympathy for contractors, because I've worked in construction for a lot of my career. And and there is a difficulty for contractors, because of course a lot of the time you're not in control of what you're doing. You're working to a design that's already been agreed between a designer and a client some point up the ladder, and you're there to deliver it. And now you'll probably get told, and I want you to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain on top of that, please. So it is a tricky thing. But what I think is that we've got good ways of doing this at a micro scale. So there are great ways of building biodiversity into developments, including city developments, getting your biodiversity credits for greening, for green roofs, green walls and so forth, for doing green and blue infrastructure, swales and other things like that. So I think we can do that. It doesn't have to be done at a major scale. But where you have losses, where that scheme has losses that can't be dealt with on site, I think it's really important not to try and just sort of crowbar it in by any means, but to actually contribute to some of these bigger initiatives. So I have clients who would like to offset their impacts by doing contributions to a big nature restoration program or rewilding initiative, rather than or preserving nature through a charity paying to preserve part of the rainforest. I don't try and crowbar it all in, but think globally as well as locally, and have that as part of your strategy, how you're going to contribute to these bigger problems overall.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question here. It's a bit open-ended, I guess, but this feels like a step change. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I really think it is a step change, and I probably keep banging on about it a lot, and I've got nothing against going out and doing badger surveys. I've done lots of them, but this isn't about just looking at your impacts on flora and fauna. It isn't even just about biodiversity net gain, as you're seeing coming through the Environment Act. It is going back and rethinking again, how could we run our business in a different way so that we actually were in harmony with nature, rather than just spending too much on the natural capital credit card that your grandchildren will never be afford to pay back.
Indeed. Okay, I've got probably time for one more, maybe. It's basically an invitation to work, I guess, but it says, would Nature Positive be interested in talking to financial institutes, e.g. pension fund managers, just to reinsure investors, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done a little bit of work in this area and presented at a few conferences in this area, and I think it is something that investors are starting to take an interest in and moving towards. And it's been there for years. We all know it's important. Everyone knows nature's important, really, don't they? They know that they rely on water and things, but it's been on the too difficult pile for quite a long time. It's just like, but how on earth do we wrestle with that particular octopus? And so I think we need to start making simple ways to get through it, but that are based on the science and evidence, and get down to where the real impacts are, and not just having a tick box going, well, we'll write a biodiversity action plan then, and we'll put up some bat boxes and beehives, because that's not the answer.
No, indeed. Okay, time for one last quick one. And this is, I'm not sure you're allowed to answer. I'm not sure. Anyway, it says, Steph, on a scale of 1 to 10, how pleased should we be that Donald Trump has now left office?
So many so many answers to that one, but let's just say I am very happy that the President of the United States of America has rejoined the Paris Agreement, and I think it bodes well for the two COPs this year in terms of biodiversity and climate change, that we have had a change in government there.
Well done, it's a nice one. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Steph. And thank you, everybody, for your attention today and all your questions. I suppose it's just left to me to say we're going to be running another one of these First Thursday Clubs next month on the 4th again. That will be hosted by Paula Reason, and it's entitled Bats, Not Just Winging It. So that should be interesting, I think. So yeah, if you could fill in the questionnaire that gets sent out after this, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again in about a month's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.